was why I'm like, all right, we got to get him on and talk about how does this relate to school leaders and culture, which we all know it crosses over. What were like the main themes within that book that I want to kind of pull in and apply towards education?
What you're describing isn't just the blocking and tackling of education. It's culture shaping. Welcome back to The Thermostat with Jason Barger. If you're currently on a commute, a walk, or just a micro break in your day, glad you're making time to step back, to think, and to reflect on the next steps on your journey. I've never been more convinced the best leaders and team cultures in the world are the ones that make time to step back, breathe in good oxygen, and calibrate their thermostat. I hope today's conversation leaves you feeling grounded and inspired. Now let's dive into today's topic to engage our minds and hearts in order to authentically lead and create compelling cultures wherever we are in the world. Hey everybody, it's Jason, and welcome back to the Thermostat Podcast. Wherever you are and however you are accessing the pod today, I'm so glad you're here. Welcome back. My promise, as always, is to hopefully provide some brief moments in your day or your week to step back and think about the person you are hoping to be and the culture you are hoping to help create with the people around you in your life and work. Before we dive into today's topic, if you'll do me a quick favor and please subscribe, of course, if you haven't already done so, but also rate the podcast 5 stars. Just this quick support would be great. Rate the podcast 5 stars and leave an authentic review with your words about why the podcast resonates with you. Again, whatever's authentic to you is really, really important. And if you're feeling like you're in an extra sharing mood, then I invite you to also share the episodes you like on social media or with your team or colleagues in whatever way is authentic for you. I say thank you to you for any of those ways. If you just take a minute to do that, that's the way that the algorithms work and help us share these messages even further in the world. So I'm so grateful for the listeners and others who help positive messages like this spread around the world. On today's podcast, we wanted to share a recent conversation that I had as a guest on the Better Learning podcast, hosted by Kevin Stoller. Kevin is the co-founder of K-12, a national leader for educational furniture. His interest in creating innovative learning environments and the impact learning environments can have on kids, teachers, communities, and ultimately our world. He wanted to learn about my educational experience and then dive into some of the topics of my most recent book, Breathing Oxygen, How Positive Leadership Gives Life to Winning Cultures. We dive into some of the mindsets and how teachers and schools can help breathe oxygen into their kids and communities. The way forward is by developing people and cultures who are breathing good oxygen together. With that, we'll share the audio from my recent appearance as a guest on their podcast.
Really, your latest book, Breathing Oxygen, which I recently read, was why I'm like, all right, we got to get him on and talk about how does this relate to school leaders and culture, which we all know it crosses over.
For sure.
So that's really what I want to talk about today. But before that, tell me about what was your school experience like?
What was my school experience like?
Yeah, what was it like going through school?
Yeah. The quick version would be, I had a great school experience. I'd say, as soon as you ask me that, my mind goes to a little bit different maybe experience than some, is that Columbus has always been home, and I had a great experience here in Columbus. But my second grade year, when I was 8 years old, my family lived in Egypt for the year.
Oh, wow.
And so actually we lived internationally for the year. And so I went to a place called Cairo American College, which was an English-speaking school with a bunch of folks from different parts of the world in Cairo. That was a wonderful experience that helped, I think, shape us in some ways that we don't even fully understand, but being able to see the world through a different lens, and that everybody doesn't.
That's really cool. So one of your parents' jobs took you there for a year?
Yeah. So my dad was in international business and, always had a bunch of random projects around the world, doing stuff to varying degrees of success and things, but just very interesting things that he was always involved in. And my parents had the foresight to realize that rather than my dad just going back and forth when he had these projects in the Middle East that were taking place, to be gone for weeks or months on time, and it's like, hey, why don't we give the kids an international experience and take them and help, provide that for them. And so, we went there and had a great experience, literally living in Cairo, and where we were, we walk around the streets and we were the minorities, and so it was a really wonderful experience.
That's really cool.
Yeah. And I've been lucky to have other great experiences. But when you ask that question, I hadn't that's where when people ask me about my childhood, my mind kind of defaults to that first. And even though I have memories before that, it kind of defaults there. And then everything kind of builds from there. Yeah.
Well, that's good. I mean, I always joke that I'm like, I don't have anything longer than 10 years ago. I don't have, I have this rolling 10-year memory.
Yeah.
And to even remember things from second grade or before, it was pretty cool to hear. So coming back, I guess, tell me what was it like then coming back and having that experience and then coming back to, because you said Columbus area.
Yeah. Came back to Columbus, and so the re-entry portion of that was wonderful in many ways, because when you're 8 years old and you've been away from a whole year, you're wondering, you miss your friends, you wonder if we're going to ever come back, and then so you're very excited to come back. But then also you've experienced something then that most people, let alone kids, they can't even imagine. And they can't even, and so it's hard for other people to relate. And so there was a little bit of a re-entry there that was a little bit harder, because people, just didn't really understand what we had just experienced. And that was okay.
Were you a good student?
I would say I was a average student that was, I would say, we've laughed about it with my kids, who are all much better students than I ever was. We laugh about it that, I always just did kind of fine and well in school, but without putting a ton of effort into it. I certainly was interested in different topics that were a lot of creative thinking and that kind of stuff. But I would say sports definitely got more of my attention. Girls got more of my attention. But I was really lucky to be in a learning environment that I think helped me have different experiences and begin to find things that I was interested in and challenged me to think in some different ways.
Okay. Well, cool. Well, awesome.
Yeah.
I think that helps kind of give a little bit of foundation in there. So what was the track then that kind of got you into this kind of thought leadership, writing, doing leadership, consulting? How did that journey come about?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, writing and creative thinking, I was always, so back to school stuff, I was involved in that. I kind of always gravitated towards creative writing and English oriented classes and those kind of things. And then I was an athlete, but I also really loved the writing side of things. And so I gravitated towards the school newspaper and became then the sports editor, and it did some fun stuff with that. And then went off to college. I went to Denison University, and again, English and communication was my major. English was a minor. Just continued. That's where I gravitated again in writing and creative kind of thinking. Coming out of college, I thought I was a basketball player. I thought I was professional sports marketing and sales was actually where things were heading and where I thought I was going to go. Ended up getting a invitation to come work for a summer camp, one that I had grown up in. And actually, when you think about learning environments, outside of a school setting, really summer camp and that camp experience was something for me that was just, monumental in my life and shaping and helping me in so many ways. And so I was actually invited by the camp director at the time to come work at this camp that I had worked at throughout college, and then the real quick version of it is that in a quick amount of time, as I was graduating college and trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life, I actually, the day I got an invitation from the Chicago Bulls to enter into this marketing and sales program that if you performed over a 4-month period or something, they'd hire you on. I actually, that same day, I had just gone to lunch and given this guy my word, a guy named John Ross. I had given him my word that I would come back and work at Camp Akita, and I would do that one last time. And so I actually turned down the Chicago Bulls to go. And they looked at me like, are you sure? But that put me on a trajectory, and the way that the quick version of the story goes is then it was a month into that summer, he pulled me aside and said, actually, I think you ought to, come work with him for the next year. It was owned and operated by a big church that was progressive in their thinking, creative in their thinking, and doing things well beyond outside of the church. They were beginning these projects, doing a lot of kind of what school districts would refer to as service learning kind of projects that were helping people develop their own leadership and service orientation, and then meeting real world needs. I was certainly interested in that. And next thing you know, it was, okay, hey, now actually I want you to be the camp director of this camp. And next thing you know, the next 10 years of my life became this. At the same time, I did a program at Georgetown, which was a nonprofit executive management program. Okay. And so my track was then going kind of leading nonprofits and was going in that direction of meeting real world needs and really rallying people to develop their own leadership thinking and how we connect the dots to doing some cool stuff in the world.
That's really cool. So was it like a summer camp, or was it specifically a basketball camp?
No. It was a summer camp, and it was owned and operated by First Community Church, which is a big church in Columbus. And but 80% of the kids that go to the camp are non-members. So it reaches 2,000 kids in a summer or something come through. So it's a really an outreach kind of thing in a very open and accepting kind of way. Again, not the way that I saw my life, the direction I thought it was going to go, but was tapped on the shoulder and said, hey, I think you ought to consider this. And then I remember even at the time, he said, why don't you make a 5-year commitment? And I looked at him like he was crazy, at that stage of life, like 5 years. And next thing you know, I was there for 10.
Oh, wow.
And so he went on to accept another role, and really he was setting up his successor. But, I went on to be the camp director, and then also lucky to be in a position where dreaming up and then leading and rallying people to started a project serving the homeless living outside of the shelter system in Columbus, and then building houses internationally in Mexico and the Dominican Republic. And, one thing after another, just kind of all fed and build on each other.
Yeah, it sounds like awesome experience. Get in there. So was there like a moment then for you, like, man, I need to, that triggered either into the writing, or what started first? Was it kind of writing, consulting? Where did that transition after camp?
Yeah, so I did, so that weirdo role that I just described, I did that for a decade. I did that for 10 years. And then, I was already, and it was a wonderful thing. I wouldn't trade any of it, a moment of it for anything, but I was already leading everything. I was already the camp director. I was already the one kind of dreaming up and leading and mobilizing people and kind of wearing all the hats of, the vision, the budget, the program design, then actually leading it. So there was really nowhere else for me to go. And even though it was a wonderful thing, I'm not exactly wired to just kind of sit still that way. I knew there was a next challenge of some sort. So I chose, my wife, Amy, and I, at the time we had 2 young kids, I chose to, hey, let's do a good transition there and try to, let the next people take that on. And I stepped out. And then while I was figuring out what was going to be next, I shared that I had this idea to write this book called Step Back from the Baggage Claim. And in order to write it, I was going to need to live in airports for a week in order to write it. And, I just quit my job. She was on maternity leave, and the wisdom of my wife.
Go live in an airport.
Yeah, which now we're spending money for me to go buy tickets to go one way, 7 different airports across the U.S. where I wasn't really going. I was just going to be in the airports. But wrote this book, Step Back from the Baggage Claim. So, again, I didn't know that was going to be what kind of launched a next path for me, although I was certainly, this was a creative endeavor that I couldn't not do it. I just knew for some reason I needed to explore this.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's awesome to hear. Because I feel like that's like, there's those moments where you're like, sometimes it just doesn't make sense, but you just feel like you're called. This is where I'm supposed to be right now.
Yeah, that was absolutely. There were some scary times in there, especially with two young kids, and my wife Amy and I looking at each other like, "Wow, do we really know where we're going or what we're doing?" But there was a lot of energy and excitement from that. We truly were exploring, and diving into the craft of writing this book that I had no idea whether anyone would care about or not. But fortunately, then people did, and that kind of began what you referenced. That began now the next phase, which has been really the last 13 years, which has now been writing books and speaking and consulting then with companies and organizations around leadership development, culture shaping, and clarity around mission, vision, and values.
Yeah. Well, cool. There's definitely a lot of commonalities here in your story of, your journey and mine. I didn't go the camp route. I went like the Fortune 500 route, and then realized I don't want to be here.
Yeah.
and kind of transition into more, like entrepreneurial things and try to figure out what to do and where the mission was and try and do that. But, turning down the bulls. I mean, I grew up in Chicago. And I would say like my first like entrepreneurial thing was doing a documentary on Michael Jordan. So yeah. I don't know if I would have been able to turn down a job with the Bulls.
Yeah, there's part of me that thinks about it now because I was a big basketball fan, and certainly that at that time the Bulls were a gigantic thing in the world, and so I think about it like, man, how did I? And yet the reality is I really didn't think about it all that much. Yeah. Like I just knew in my gut that was at that time, for whatever reason, I knew that was right. I had, and I haven't second guessed that decision really at all.
Yeah. Isn't it amazing? Like some the major decisions are just like so easy to make in the time. Yeah. I really feel like your book here and your message is stuff that it crosses pretty much every industry. Like leadership, it's just one of those things that you put a good leader in somewhere and they're going to figure out, maybe not right away. Maybe they have to like adjust to the different culture and learn some specialties. But leadership is one of the things that I'm just like, I feel like it's the number one influencer of how well our schools are and for our communities, and putting yourself kind of in that situation with like things that you've learned and writings about. Why don't you talk through a little bit kind of like those leadership principles as things like in Breathing Oxygen that kind of you talk about? What were like the main themes within that book that I want to kind of pull in and apply towards education?
If you haven't done so already, we hope you'll visit Amazon or Amplify or jasonvbarger.com to check out Breathing Oxygen, my new book that is all about breathing good oxygen into ourselves and mindsets that fuel ourselves and the teams and the organizations around us. Positive, healthy thinking is as essential to great leadership and building a winning culture as the air we breathe. Leading yourself and a team of people has never been more complicated than it is today. As a leader, every move you make is either breathing life into your organization or slowly killing it. The atmosphere can easily turn toxic with negativity, blame, and doubt poisoning the culture. Just like every being on the planet needs good air to breathe, every organization needs leadership that breathes life into its people to sustain the energy required to complete its mission. Breathing Oxygen focuses on 6 key leadership mindsets that breathe life into any team: clarity, inclusivity, mental agility, grit, rest, and ownership. Join us, read, and share Breathing Oxygen.
Available now from Amplify Books on Amazon and jasonvbarger.com.
that kind of you talk about? What were like the main themes within that book that I want to kind of pull in and apply towards education?
Yeah. Well, so Kevin, like when I hear you ask that question or make that statement that leadership is such a big part of leading a school, I think 20 some years ago when I was, years and years ago in my career, I would have definitely said that. I still would have said that statement. And now being, much further along in my career, I'm more convinced of that than ever. Of just watching that, and not just schools, but leading any entity of any kind. And so when you think about, the leadership of yourself, for one, and how you decide to show up in the world, and the way that you operate yourself, and the mindset that you develop of how you organize and lead yourself forward in all the things that are within our control, in the midst of a world that has so much that's out of our control. I think that really is, again, I've always known that to be significant, but I'm more convinced of it than ever at this stage. And I watch every entity on the planet, from our individual leadership to, leading a family, to leading a school, to leading a team across industries. I'm lucky to get to work with many different organizations and companies across industries. And I've never been more convinced of how critical it is to have leaders that are aligned with the people, aligned with a mission that's greater than themselves, and then are in the business of developing the people around them and developing the mindset and the actions that will follow. Which of course creates a culture. It is that all of us are co-creators and creating culture with the people around us. So I know that to be true for every entity on the planet, at least the ones that I'm lucky enough to get to be a part of.
Yeah, for sure. And I always talk about this too. It's like those school leaders are so unique in that they're not just leading like their organization. What they're doing actually like spreads out into the community, into the parents, into the community members there, that I can't think of another role. I can say like maybe in politics to some degree. But the idea that you put a good leader, a good principal, a good superintendent in, it changes everything for that community.
Yeah. It's absolutely, it's invaluable. And you think about what you're describing isn't just the blocking and tackling of education. It's culture shaping.
Right.
It's the environment of learning. And so if culture is dynamic, which means it's always changing and it's always moving and it's changing every day by the way we think, act, and interact, then the leadership of that ecosystem, the role of aligning with the other people within the system. And when you talk about kids and families and creating an environment where that culture where people can thrive, that is that doesn't just magically happen. There has to be leadership that sees that and then understands and knows how to do that.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of it is that they're coming in, and I think it's really common in a lot of industries too. It's like, like somebody will kind of start in there. So a lot of the times they're starting as teachers, mm-hmm. and they're moving their way up. And so they have a lot of this institutional knowledge of like how to do the job. But maybe I would say almost all the time is, like their first leadership roles are their first times leading the roles. So not only are they first time leaders, but then they're coming in, and just like every other manager kind of has this issue, is you typically go into a managerial role and now you're a manager of mm-hmm. your friends, of your peers, of trying to now separate yourself, do that. And that's a tough thing to do, especially knowing that the stat blew me away is the average tenure of a superintendent is 2.9 years. They just typically don't last that long. So now you're kind of thrown into this role, and and you got probably 3 years to try to prove yourself, and it's really hard to do it in that short amount of time. And that's kind of the same thing in principals, where we see a lot of times teacher will move into will move up into an assistant principal or principal role, but then they get in there like, oh, I don't like this. And they pull themselves out of it. When you're talking to people and experiences, like what are you usually starting kind of culture first? Like what are some of those like things that you're seeing in commonalities of really good leaders?
Yeah. So one, I'd say I've got so many thoughts. By the way, of just listening to you ramble. So I've got so many thoughts on what.
Good. They're probably better thoughts than I have. So
no. That was good. I've got so many different directions we could go with this. But I do believe that it starts with a leadership mindset of how you even think about what it means to lead. I say this all the time that I believe the term leadership has been hijacked in the world today. And what I mean by that is that we use the term leadership and we oftentimes talk about how important it is, and we throw it around and on our teams and organizations like, hey, we need you to lead better. And if only we had more leadership. But yet we oftentimes don't step back and really identify, well, what does authentic and influential and exceptional leadership really look like? How do we define that, right? And so how we think about leadership impacts every room we walk into and every conversation that we have, I believe. And so beginning with some of those leaders, and oftentimes in organizations that are very, if they're older models, very hierarchical by design in many cases, if a leader thinks that what it means to be the leader is to be at the top of the pyramid and the top of the organizational chart, and that the role of the leader is they've earned their way up to the top, and their role as a leader is to be the master delegator and the general and the hard driving person that barks out orders and tells everybody what to do, then that's the way, if that's what they think about what it means to lead, that's how they're going to show up. And in a very complex world, especially over the last 2.5 years and everything we've experienced in the world, that kind of top-down style of leadership, I believe, has never truly been all that effective, or at least burns people out. And you could argue it's effective for a period of time and then kind of burns bridges with people. But really, the mindset of flipping that pyramid upside down, and leaders that even if they are at the top of the organizational chart or the hierarchy or are the superintendent or the principal or somebody with that by title, that how they think about leadership, they don't think of it that way. They see their role as a leader as someone who's there to serve a mission greater than themselves, is to put other people in position to be successful, to lead in ways that are bigger than themselves. And that framing of how they think about leadership impacts the way they show up to every decision they make, every room they enter, and how they then enter into this ecosystem of a culture then that they are trying to shape. And depending on how you think about it and see your role as a leader, it's going to take you down some different paths.
Yeah, for sure. And hearing you talk through that, it is very much of this self-awareness of the leaders coming in, kind of recognizing that other people are going to view you differently because of that title that you have. But how do you then actually drive culture change? How do you feel like, how do you make people feel like they are there to fulfill the mission of the organization and not to serve you as the leader? Which I think that's kind of what happens a lot when you see those leadership fails, is that I am the leader and they are here to serve you, versus kind of flipping that servant leadership around.
Yeah. And one of the things I talk about in my book, Thermostat Cultures, which really that book is about what is the process that we go through to shape culture. And so the reason why it's called Thermostat Cultures is because it plays off the image of the difference between a thermometer and a thermostat, that so many individual leaders, but also teams and organizations, get stuck in what I refer to as thermometer thinking. And that is, if they don't have clarity around the type of leader they're trying to be or the type of culture that they're trying to create together, then really the culture they end up creating and experiencing is just like a thermometer, and the temperature just goes up each day depending on all the external conditions that are around us. And so, the culture that people experience, the temperature just goes up and down each day, and it's very scattered and inconsistent, which is different than a leader and or a team and an entire organization when they begin to align themselves around thermostat kind of thinking, which is that means we have to do the work and together process and dive into the culture shaping process to get clear on, well, how is it that we want to show up as leaders, and what is that culture that we want to create? What are we not reactionary to just the things that are happening around us, those external conditions, but what is it that we proactively want to create? And then what's really the change process that we go through to create and shape and set the temperature for the culture that we want intentionally and authentically? What are we going to go do in order to align people around it? And one of the things I talk about that, not only of that book is really about what is that process that we go through to shape culture and how do we inspire teams of people to do it. One of the things I talk about is that we are in a participatory world. And so that top down kind of thinking of just because I'm the boss, I tell you what to do and think that everybody's going to magically fall in line. Like, one, I don't think that's ever really been the case outside of some very military type environments. And even then we can look at and say, how effective really were they? But, to think the world that we live in right now that is so participatory, really the role of the leader is to get, so it's not just, a principal or a superintendent that says, now you're the teacher, do what I say. Is like, how do we rally as a district, as a school, as teachers and co-educators together to then get clear on what is that culture that we want to create and how are we all participants in setting that temperature? And what does that look like in the different roles that we may play? And so that's the way that my mind goes first, right, is aligning around, do we even know what that temperature is that we want?
Yeah. Now, and that's a good point, and something that I think is really, I guess what came to mind for me is I've been part of big organizations, smaller organizations. I have to say, like, I love smaller organizations because it's just more intimate, and you can have like more, everyone kind of is more valued in, from my experience of doing that, is that everyone is like truly needed. Once you start getting into bigger organizations, it starts getting harder, and then you start getting all these other agendas that kind of go in there. So I think we see it kind of in the bigger districts on the school side, but then you also see it in the bigger companies, because I've said it a lot of times in my career that if you like your manager, you probably like your job.
Yeah.
So are people really following kind of their immediate manager? And then how does that manager fall into the bigger part of the organization so that when people move on, move up, like move into different roles, that it's not just like kind of individual leaders? How does that whole organization start working together? And that's stuff that I don't know. I've never been able to see it or do it in my career. But I thought you may be able to have a little more color that of in a bigger organization, how it goes beyond just kind of like your immediate kind of leader into more of the culture of the organization.
Well, it has to be intentional, and it has to be a structure by design that I talk about again in thermostat cultures. I talk about the change process. I refer to it as the 6 A's. And because I think it's easier for people to wrap their head around if they haven't ever studied change theory before, but to look at it and to realize that, again, we don't have time for me to go into all of it, but one of the A's is that alignment. And so if, the bigger the organization gets, the more complex the organization gets, continuing to be intentional about how we stay aligned at all levels of the organization. None of this am I claiming to be easy at all. But is the effort, and when done well, you point to any school district that you admire, any professional sports team, or big company organization that you admire. If you start to study and peel back the intentionality that they bring to the aligning of the culture that they are creating together, you'll start to see that oh, that there's an actual process to leading change and setting that temperature. And then so getting clear on that, what is that temperature that we want to set, and beginning to think about in the intentionality around, are we going to be willing to go on that process together? And then you mentioned breathing oxygen and asking the mindset that come out of that. Breathing Oxygen is my most recent book that just launched this August. That is once you are clear on what is the culture that you're trying to create, Breathing Oxygen really was born out of what we've experienced over the last 2.5 years of a time of great anxiety and trauma for so many people, a global pandemic. Are my kids being schooled at home or online, and everything that came with that? The issues of systematic racism and social injustice, and wars around the world, and political uncertainty and economic uncertainty, and so much angst and division and fighting, and now the Great Resignation, and what's the future of work look like? All of this stuff that is externally we are all experiencing. How do we as leaders, how do I need to breathe oxygen into myself? And what are the mindsets that, once I'm clear on the culture that I want to be a part of and I want to help create, what are the mindsets I'm going to need to individually continue to breathe oxygen into myself in a world where the oxygen at times is feeling like it's being taken from us and it's being harder to breathe, And then it talks about, well, how do we breathe oxygen into others? And that really our role as leaders is to not only breathe oxygen into ourselves, but to breathe oxygen into others. And so, but it means in the midst of challenges that we're going to have to breathe oxygen into this kind of thinking, acting, and interacting that will help us navigate some of the biggest challenges we're facing.
Yeah. Talk a little bit about your analogy with the bamboo too, because that was one that stuck with me when I was reading.
Yeah. So I learned about this years ago. This idea of bamboo is, when you see bamboo, that it grows, it looks like it just grows straight up and down out of the ground. And somebody then once shared with me that that's actually not what happens under the ground. That what actually happens is it starts out with something called a culm, which a little, grouping of seeds or a little kind of bud underneath the ground. And the bamboo starts to grow under the surface in one direction, and then grows a little bit, and for whatever reason switches then direction and starts growing in another direction and then another direction. And it has all these offshoots underneath the surface and all these different directions underneath. And then when it is quote unquote ready, or I'm not sure why or when it knows this, but eventually it then turns and it comes, when it's ready to come, it comes through the surface and goes straight up and down. And that's what we see. And that image for me of how bamboo grows has been a really powerful image for the creative process, or for realizing that culture shaping isn't just a one linear line. It is we need to be able to embrace the different switchbacks that are going to take place, not only in the creative process with anything that you might be a project or an initiative that you're working on, but being willing to let things marinate and learn and grow a little bit and adapt and adjust and allow to follow that growth until then, eventually, I think some illumination, if you know of the kind of the 4 stages of the creative process that at least was identified years and years ago, one of them is illumination. And so as you are creatively allowing ideas and things to marinate and wander and learn from them, eventually there's an illumination point in the process that says, this is now a direction that we need to go, and let it go, and need to follow it and allow it to come to life. And so I very much, that image continues, because I think it's obviously, we know this as humans, but we also know this as learners, that it's not just one linear path, that we know that our students, they develop in a lot of different switchbacks and ways along the way.
Yeah, it made me think of a similar analogy, even though it's like a different, little different point on the analogy, but like the redwood trees of like, you're going to get up to like Redwood National, and you're like, how in the world did these trees grow so tall? And then if you start looking at like, well, that root system and the idea that they can't grow that tall alone. Like their roots are getting completely intertwined with all the other trees around it. And that's what allows all of them to grow so tall, is that they have to have that connection. They have to really kind of have that same mission for all of them to grow together. So it made me think of like, a little different point to it, but like really cool just to see of like looking at like, well, look at success and then look at like, well, why did that happen? Because there's probably some real reasons why, if you really start looking underneath the ground. And to your point with that intentionality,
it didn't just magically happen. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, kind of like the same thing of like show me a 10-year, an overnight success, and you'll see that there's 10 years of hard work to get to that point too.
And again, in the most successful or admirable school districts that that come to your mind or that you think of, or anybody that's listening thinks of, that's an honor and respect and salute to those many, many, many leaders and people that have been making, what seemingly are tiny little adjustments and or practices and ways in which they do things that have led to help create that culture over many, many years. That's the way that culture shaping works and eventually then people say, wow, look at this amazing tree that's been growing like this, but there's been real intentionality to it.
Yeah. I know we're getting to the point here. You gotta get running. I want to respect that. But I guess the last point is I feel like the common thread that we keep hearing in the education world is, you mentioned the last 2.5 years is this idea that people have lost trust in the system. And I think that's where the leaders are right now of trying to get to this point of like, how do I rebuild trust, whether like they actually lost it or, like the community just has kind of gotten things from outside of their communities of like that have kind of just doubted their intentions and kind of put this wall of distrust in there, and it's making these school leaders' jobs really hard to try to like reestablish trust, even if it wasn't kind of their doing.
No doubt
to change it.
I wish I had all the answers in the world for you. But I guess I mean, I'll just share my thoughts. I don't think this is. I think the school environment is certainly a unique one in that sense because the complexities of the stakeholders and everybody in a community and all that for sure. But I'll just say that I see that everywhere, and that I think that we as humans over the last 2.5 years that there's been a lot of trauma and a lot of angst, and when we as humans face with trauma and angst and fear and all the things that we've been, then oftentimes a lot of that fight or flight mentality comes out. And I think we are still, there's been a lot of bridges that have been burned and or I think that's where some of that distrust that you're talking about comes from. And the reality is I think it's all pain and it's hurt and it's all of us as humans of just dealing with uncertainty is not it's not easy for anyone. And I'm not saying that as just making an excuse, but then the way that I think about it to your point of what do we do is how do we build that trust back is the same way that we've ever built trust in the first place. Is that trust is something that also doesn't just happen overnight. We like to say that we blindly decide just to trust each other. And I do think there is a choice that we make to choose to trust and begin that. But the reality is relationships are all that are all built on trust. We are already always making investments into that bank account with each other. So, we are always earning our level of trust with people, or we are detracting from it. And so what can leaders and what do stakeholders and what do communities and hopefully what do parents, and we all need to start investing in that social equity a little bit more at a time and start building some of that trust back. And I wish it was one flip of the switch and everything, but that's just never the way that it's ever worked anyway. And so trust is something that we earn, and it gets bartered back and forth with each other every single day. And I would just invite us all to think about, myself including, is, well, what are those relationships that I want to invest in and that I'm willing to work to build that trust back with? Those are the places and leaders and cultures that will slowly begin to build some authentic base of trust back with their people, and then will begin to be able to navigate their way through all the complexities we're still facing.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I feel like we could, we're just getting going in some ways here, but I think, like this discussion, and for the listeners to take some of this and run with it, I would definitely encourage looking up Jason. We'll have his links in here, and his recent book of Breathing Oxygen, and try to figure out how can we incorporate that. But I feel like a lot of times, kind of my last point here is that we look to the leaders to do everything. And to the listener, you may not be in a leadership role. Sometimes it's just really important to try to recognize what your leaders are trying to do too. And that may be part of that trust that can be rebuilt here, is maybe look at it from their perspective a little bit of what are they trying to do and how difficult their role is. And I'll wrap it all back up to basketball because it's always a great way to bring it back. But I was just watching this Lakers legacy series. And you look at, you got a great player like Kobe Bryant. He can't do it on his own. He had to kind of pull back in and get like Phil Jackson and have some leadership to really help him grow into his full potential. And I think a lot of times there's just a lot of natural distrust to leadership that really does require kind of everyone to check their ego and say, hey, this isn't about serving like a leader. This is about serving a greater purpose. And there just happens to be a leader that, is the one that's kind of the visible role out there. So, yeah,
the two final thoughts that I would just share related to what you were just saying is that when I talk about leadership, I think there are some listeners that are on this right now that will be leaders in the sense by title, that yes, they're in a position of leadership. But just because we know that just because you're in a position of leadership doesn't mean that you lead. It just means you have that role.
Right.
When I talk about leadership, that we are all leaders in the sense that someone's watching and taking cues from us about how we show up and respond to the world around us. And so whether you are in a position of leadership or not formally, you have an ability to lead and to help be a co-creator in that, investing in the relationships and in the culture that you want to create. And then to remember that we are all ambassadors for the culture that we want to create. So not just the leaders, all of us, which means if we have a culture that we desire. So if I and my family or with my wife or my friends or, certainly your team or your organization that you work for or your district, if there's a culture that you want to be a part of creating, then we have to be willing to, as you said, kind of check the ego, but also say, well, what am I willing to contribute to it? Because we are all ambassadors for the culture we want to create.
Yep. Well, good discussion. Thanks, Jason. I really appreciate it. And to the listeners, if you've not already subscribed, just hit subscribe wherever you're listening to this, and reach out to us. We always want to get more feedback and guest suggestions and topics, because at the end of the day, it's just like what we're talking about here. It's really everyone's got this vested interest in improving our education system, and it's not just upon the leaders to do it. It's upon everyone who's listening to this and part of our culture. So. Thanks, Jason. Glad we were able to finally connect here.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. Thank you for listening to today's podcast, and I hope the messages and questions stimulate positive change along your path. As always, if these messages resonate with you and add value to your life, I hope you'll help amplify them throughout the world. Please rate, comment, and share on whatever podcast or social media platform you're using. And share this podcast with the people in your life or work who should be part of these conversations. That way, this spirit does, in fact, spread. If these messages or developing leaders and culture would be helpful to you and your organization, please contact us at jasonvbarger.com, jasonvbarger.com. And remember, we are all ambassadors for the culture we want to create in our life and work. We have to own the vision we want to be a part of. The future of leadership is you, is me, is us. Be a thermostat.